Hello, my name's Anthony Pagnato, and you're tuning in to Borderline Genius, the podcast where my colleague Kenton Grimes and I talk about all things trade and freight related. How are you doing today, Kenton?
I am doing well. Or if we want to bring back our oldest joke, I am terrified.
Terrified. You know, this podcast has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it, and I'd like to give a thanks for anybody who's tuned in and listened. I think you told me something really cool the other day with your youngest child, your son, who now thinks and that is let's talk about this here. You are a licensed customs broker. You
hmm
are and you've been in this business for 20 years. You've been in front of thousands of companies. You've spoken at many trade related events. You've worked with law firms. You've done amazing things. And you told me that your son believes your job is what exactly?
Making podcasts.
That is fantastic. I'm glad to see we've made an impact, and we will have him on to do a little podcast about Spider-Man. I believe was the route we were going to
Spider-Man,
go.
Spider-Man and Transformers. That's what he wants us
Spider-Man
to
and
talk about.
Transformers, or how much Spider-Man and Transformers action figures are going to cost for Christmas. Maybe a
There you
more
go.
appropriate situation. Today we are recording. It is June 4th.
hmm
Big day in global trade, and we're going to talk about a couple different things here. One being 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, which Kenton has all the scoop on. And then we're also getting pretty close to June 9th, which is another significant day for trade, and we'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about what we see going on in the global freight market as we've seen a little bit of a reprieve from China on the tariffs as we've seen the reciprocal tariffs fall and we've seen shipping pick up out of China. And so we'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing there. But Kenton, before we get cooking here, any general topics you want to talk about or anything I left off of our little agenda?
No, I think you've nailed it. We are not going to have an episode without tariff talk. So that is going to be probably a large portion of what we discuss. Some of which being what exists, what was announced, and what might be in the future. So it should be exciting. And then I think it's nice to incorporate a little bit of what we see on the freight side of things because it as the tariff world changes, the supply and demand dynamic seems to shift. That we're at the fulcrum there. The tariffs are the fulcrum of that supply chain. So we're seeing supply and demand ebb and flow somewhat as the rates move one way versus another.
Absolutely. There's been some profound impacts, including empty ports in the United States and now possible port congestion. So plenty to come on that. But I think we'll start with the number one issue, June 4th, 2025, the increase in 232 tariff, mostly across the board, right, on steel and aluminum. But there's a whole lot more to it than that, as there always is when you get in it and read the language. This change, this executive order, and the rules promulgated therefore, as you've gone in, Kenton, and you know what I may have glossed over as more of a freight guy myself, than a tariff guy, than a customs brokerage guy. There's quite a bit going on here that is a change from the pre-existing 232 regime. Is that right?
There's a lot at play. Again, when we first started our podcast, I talked about the implementation of the IEEPA tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, as a little more sophisticated methodology for the Trump 2.0 administration versus the Section 301. Some of the nuance that we saw with the implementation of some of the tariffs were the ineligibility of duty drawback and the forcing of FTZ entries to bring products in under foreign privilege status. And I think what we've seen in this new write-up of the 232 is, again, a little more sophisticated wording that edged out or cut out some loopholes or some avenues for duty mitigation that existed in the initial implementation. In that, what I mean specifically is when the 232 on steel and aluminum derivatives was announced, it was announced that articles eligible for 232 tariffs were not eligible for reciprocal. So there was a run on importers adding aluminum, adding steel into their product so that, and then potentially changing the classification of the product to fall into these derivative classification codes so that they could avoid the reciprocal rate of 125% and only pay the 232 rate of 25% at the time. What
Is it
we
fair
are
to
seeing,
say? I mean, like we've talked about that on previous episodes, and sorry for cutting you off there, but I
No,
mean
you're
that
good.
that was very strange to me from day one. I believe we clearly called out the strange impact that had specifically with China, right? Like specifically with China, with other countries that were looking at reciprocal tariff rates of 10%, right? Mitigated down to 10%. It was still a higher tariff rate on aluminum and steel, but it had this strange impact on China, right? Whereas steel and aluminum are these industries that we need to support in the U.S., and that's the rallying cry of the administration. It had the impact of lowering the stacked duty rate on this wide swath of products. Again, we're not talking about rolled steel or aluminum sheets here. We're not talking about raw materials, while they're definitely in there. We're talking about a broad swath of tariff codes, including products that contain steel. So furniture has been hit, other areas, right? Plenty of other commodities that contain iron and or steel, iron and or steel and or aluminum.
There you go. Yeah, iron was
probably your iron contains steel and or aluminum. So
I should hope your iron doesn't contain steel. That would be bad. Hopefully, it's just iron.
Talking about your iron for your clothes.
Well, yeah. So, I thought you were talking about my. I thought you were talking about my. What do they call? Oh, geez, the pills.
I don't know. I don't want to know what kind of pills you're on.
I don't know. Supplements. There we go.
Yes.
Wow.
Whatever supplements you're taking, let's crank them up a notch, okay?
Yeah. That was not that didn't work well.
I
need to call Elon and get that brain chip. Hey, recall. I need to recall my vocab words from second grade.
You are the number one. You are the number one client. So we look forward to that. But going back to where we were, we had this odd effect, right? Where the stack duty rate was less for articles containing steel and or aluminum, and that has now been blown away. Correct?
Yep.
Talk to us here. What is the calculation method? It's kind of complicated, right?
It is more complicated now. So, unlike the initial rollout, the steel and aluminum derivatives are going to, even if the classification falls within the chapter of steel or aluminum, so 73 and 76, the value of the material will receive the 50% tariff, but the value of the remaining portion of the product. So if we're talking about, let's talk about a ladder in chapter 73. So a good ladder has a steel ladder, not an aluminum. A good steel ladder will have rope and twine so that, from a safety sake, then you've got some rubber footings and some other componentry and such in it. only the value of the steel itself will carry the 50% 232. The fabrication, the plastic feet and grips and the rope will all carry the standard tariff rate. And if that is coming out of a country that has IEEPA fentanyl, has a reciprocal IEEPA tariff, those rates will stack onto that and onto the value of the product non-associated with the material in 232.
So to simplify it, you've got a product, you've got to bifurcate it into its steel or aluminum component value, its non-steel and aluminum component value.
The remaining value,
The steel and the aluminum components get the 232, and the non-steel and aluminum are tariffed at the active tariff rate, including fentanyl, including reciprocal tariffs. So speaking specifically of China, where those are still up there, they are dutied at the rate, the normal rate for those. So there's no more that being left off, right?
Right.
So that was left off. That section was not dutied with the reciprocal tariffs under the previous rules. So that's a pretty big change.
That's a massive change. I mean, the other, I guess it's not a change, but the other nuance that was interesting is because the UK agreed in principle with the deal with the administration, they did not see an increase from 25% to 50%. So they're static at 25%, the initial 232 rate. And that, I wonder, and not to get too far ahead of our conversation, but I wonder if that's a little bit of a nugget from the administration to incentivize the other countries to get to a deal quickly. He set a deadline for the 9th on the reciprocal deals. And it's important that it's on the 9th for multiple reasons. One, we expect the Court of Appeals to be receiving the final arguments from both parties on the case recently announced that CIT there was a challenge to the IEEPA. There was a challenge to the Trump administration's use of IEEPA to initiate these tariffs, and the Court of International Trade found in favor of the plaintiffs, stating that the government did not have the authority to initiate tariffs, or that specifically the Trump administration did not have the authority to initiate tariffs under that act. Of course, the administration quickly filed an appeal, and the Federal Court of Appeals granted a stay, allowing the tariffs to stay in place. But on the 9th is when they expect both the plaintiff and the defendant's arguments to be in hand so they can review the merits of the case and judge on the appeal.
So a lot of things going on the 9th. As a reminder, and you mentioned this, when we had the big Rose Garden celebration of Independence Day or Freedom Day or whatever it was.
Liberation Day.
Liberation Day, where we were freed from the shackles of the horrific trade practices of countries such as Sri Lanka, right? That have just been, anyway. Enough sarcasm. But when we had that initial rollout, there were pretty high tariff values on many countries around the world, and the rest were identified. If you weren't a named country, it was 10%. We saw a fairly quick moratorium placed on that, which relieved the markets pretty quickly, caused a lot of relief. And as those rates were brought back down to 10%, that moratorium that again was widely celebrated in the trade community, things have been oddly quiet since then. You and I have talked about potentially India being the first domino to fall on this podcast, on this show, which it hasn't been, and we've still not heard anything there. Of course, the UK was the first to come to the table and reach a substantive agreement and only country that we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so things have been oddly quiet. We now are knocking on the door of June 9th.
Hi there, this is Rachel, a producer of Borderline Genius. Pardon our brief interruption. No, we don't have sponsors. Yet. We just wanted to provide a bit of clarity here. You're hearing reference to the 9th a lot in this podcast, and our host just referenced June 9th as the deadline for the pause on heightened reciprocal tariffs. Forgive him. He didn't have enough caffeine prior to recording. There are 2 dates to take note of. On June 9th, the administration will defend the IEEPA tariffs in response to the appeals court. Trump has set July 9th as the deadline for trade talks with countries to avoid Liberation Day tariff rates. There's a reason we call them borderline geniuses. Now, back to your hosts.
When this reprieve went in, and the last I heard from this administration was everybody, all these countries better come and give the United States their best and final offer. Feels like, who wants to be a millionaire? Is that your final answer, right? Best and final offer, because I don't want to use the word threat. I don't believe it's a threat. I believe that the administration intends to push those tariffs back up on the 9th, although nobody can be certain. So we're knocking on the door of the 9th, of some double-digit tariff increases on trading partners like the European Union, which have come under tremendous fire from the president and his staff over the last month or two.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam was a big one, right? In that it was 40-something%, if I recall correctly, right?
I think it was 46 out of Vietnam, correct?
Yeah, and so we're looking at some substantial trade increases. Let's talk about this case. The U.S. Court of International Trade, based in D.C., right, was presented a multi-party lawsuit. Many parties. There's a lot of et als in that,
a lot of
right?
et als, as we read it, yes.
In the plaintiff defendant sections. They were sued. Can you tell me what the claim of the plaintiff group was in this, and what the Court of International Trade ruled? Can we get into the nuance there?
So, as best as I understand it, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to pretend like I am
disclaimer.
one. Disclaimer,
right? Yeah.
No. And I slept in my own bed, not at a Holiday Inn Express. But the as I understand it, the argument was under the IEEPA Act of 1977 that it was a replacement for the Trading with Enemies Act, which was used prior to being replaced by IEEPA, was used by President Nixon to initiate tariffs. And when they rewrote when they wrote IEEPA to replace TWEA, it held intact a lot of the executive powers and oversights for economic things such as embargoes and sanctions. However, it specifically did not articulate tariffs in the powers that would be granted. It was to curtail the just unchecked powers of the executive branch, while still under what the authors articulated as emergencies that were generally defined as short in duration and immediate in instance. So it tried to create a little more of a constraint around that power, so it could only be used for what was an immediate and short-term emergency.
IEEPA, as written, as the trade court ruled, based on reading the original intent, reading the debate around the act and the creation of the act, right, which is one form of judicial interpretation used,
right,
was meant for small, short, quick situations, right?
Right.
And the claim of the class and the holding of the court was that this is not a small, quick thing. This is touching every country in the world. It's broad. There's many reasons, and therefore that power should be reserved for the legislative branch of government. Is that
Right.
that's the short of it?
Yes.
And that was, as you would expect, anytime you have a court case whereby an immediate action based on that would cause major disruption to what was going on, was immediately stayed. I don't think that was surprising at all. And now there is an appeal to the appellate district whereby we could have one of several outcomes. The first one would be the court's equivalent of a pass.
Yeah, I mean they could pass. They could also lift the stay.
Yes.
They could find in favor. I mean, if they find in favor of the plaintiff, again, the administration will shoot this up to the Supreme Court. And
absolutely right. So they could immediately say that the plaintiffs were right. In which this will get appealed to the Supreme Court. They could say that the plaintiffs were wrong and the lower court erred in issuing their judgment, right? And the administration is fine, in which case the litigants, the plaintiffs, will likely appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But there is a ruling that is, and we talked about it earlier, that could come out. And it's something that courts have used sometimes when they don't want to rule on the merits of the case, right? And that would be
that the plaintiffs didn't have standing.
Which, standing is required in any lawsuit. And you have to show that there was actual harm to you as someone who has filed the lawsuit. And in this case, a lot of the plaintiffs are groups that represent people that were harmed. Such as the NRF, National Retail Foundation, or other organizations like that. I don't know if you have any of the others off the top of your head. I don't.
Well, I know 12 states were actually also part of it, which it's hard to say because the state doesn't pay the tariff. But
right.
So again, the question is, can they
standing questions are extremely complicated, right? I mean, there's a lot that can be argued there. But I think the most unsatisfying response, even if it's a correct one, right? No judgment on the appellate court here, no pun intended. But even if it's an unsatisfying one, I mean that's a legitimate concern. Is standing in any case, but boy, would that be an unsatisfying ruling, right? Like, I think everybody would be a lot better served if this made it to the Supreme Court, so it could be ruled on the merits. So that we can have some predictability, right? Which has been kind of the crux outside of the extra cost, outside of the burden of doing business, the lack of predictability. So the sooner we get some predictability with a ruling, personally, again, I don't want to get political. I don't see the tariffs as a great mechanism for doing this. So I'd like to see that power reined in, but reasonable minds can disagree. And, with that, I do hope that there's a ruling finding that this power should have been reserved for the legislative branch. I do think, and I'm curious as to your opinion, if this does make it to the Supreme Court, I think you and I split decision here, right? You go ahead. What do you think the Supremes will do?
I think the Supreme Court, if it goes to them, there's enough historical evidence of why IEEPA was formed and why it replaced the Trading with Enemies Act, TWIA, as it was called, that based on all of their other rulings, they like to show precedent, they like to show the intent of the authors. And so I believe they will find consistently across the board that the IEPA powers do not authorize tariff, allowing the president to initiate tariffs.
And I believe I am a Supreme Court pessimist, and that's not this Supreme Court. That's many historical courts. I believe that a lot of Supreme Court justices like to say how they like to rule based on precedent, beliefs, based on original interpretation, right? Based on understanding the true intent, what have you. Any different school
Right.
of interpretation, until they're faced with a case that runs against their personal political viewpoints. These are human beings. They have viewpoints. As much as they may try or try not, depending on who they are, to be apolitical, I would bet you a nice dollar bill, crisp, clean dollar bill,
Clean.
that if this makes it to the Supreme Court, which will be a while from now, that it's ruled on along ideological. I can't say it. Party split. I'll say it. So and the President Trump and his administration win. I don't know that that's the right ruling, but I would not be shocked at all. And again, I will wager one crispy $1 bill on that. So we will see where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously my bias is towards them ruling in the affirmative. I would like to see the IEPA tariff function eliminated. And that's not to say that I disagree that the president shouldn't have some authority. I like the Section 232, 301 process because it's more deliberate, and it goes through a comment period, a research period, and there are things that the industry has the opportunity to partake and participate in, which I believe helps put together a more collaborative and a more it allows the industry to create a strategy to
stability.
help.
And I think we have a great example. If you go back and look at this executive order around the 232, right? And the rules following that, it's not something we talked about when we were talking about the 232 increasing from 25% to 50%. There was no delay on that for transportation. Right. So you could have loaded in good faith 25 containers worth of $1 million of product, right? A month and a half ago, expecting a 25% tariff and having that baked into your cost. And by the time that thing lands, right, and is cleared, the tariff is 50%. And previous executive orders, we have seen a gap for transportation, right? Am I correct?
You are correct. We have seen a gap.
And we don't see that here.
No.
So, I mean, unpredictability, there's bound to be some organizations out there. So, and I think that speaks just to what you're talking about, the predictability of having these things go through a legislative period, a comment period, and not be the realm of one guy with a pen, right?
The interesting part about the 232 though is that section of law also is where we get anti-dumping and countervailing duties.
Yeah. And
we know that those are not locked in at the time of import. They can change up until liquidation. So if you're an importer who is subject to the 232, you do know what that number looks like today, but you also know that it could retroactively change based on the way that law that is stipulated. You have
do we know?
Well,
and I say that because now we have a massive broad scope of tariff codes that are subject to 232 that have never been. And yes, the argument can be made, you should know, right? Or you should have made it your business to know. But I think of the hundreds of customers that I deal with, and I don't think most of our folks who are importing steel or aluminum containing If you're a pure steel importer, sure, I suspect that your compliance team has that down. If you're bringing in a guitar with a steel or aluminum components, I
you're
don't
not.
know that is in your thought process, right?
I agree. But at least in the process of things moving, and I would contend a little bit, if we were only looking at the 232 tariffs as the mechanism du jour of this administration, more robust communication from the trade community like ourselves would be looking at these, I'll call them infinitesimal kind of nuance, whereas we're built right now around a reaction to all sorts of layering tariffs. So it's like, okay, well, we have this IEEPA tariff that is reciprocal. Then we also have this IEEPA tariff that is based on fentanyl. Then we also have a threatened IEEPA tariff on Venezuelan oil. And then we have the 301, the 232, and so with the colorful palette of tariffs that are out there, it's difficult to get to the microscopical detail and difference in them all. So we're kind of shooting people instead of with they've got those laser jet cutters instead of with that fine laser stream where fire, it's a fire hose of information, and it's hard to parse out what is relevant to you and what is just generic.
Lot more duty paid on laser cutters than fire hoses as well. I have no doubt.
Very true.
I love the conversation from a trade point of view. So we've talked about the big news. 232 steel and aluminum going up today, effective today, on entries from 25% to 50%, unless you're importing out of the UK. And we have a pretty big day coming up on the 9th, which is the end or theoretical end of the stay on the original reciprocal tariffs that were celebrated in the White House Rose Garden. And we also have arguments due from the administration's case, arguing in front of the appellate court that the lower court erred in ruling that IEEPA powers were overused and incorrectly applied. So a big week for trade. Do we have any other trade topics? We'll talk a little bit about ocean freight here, because all this hammers ocean freight. So I'll give a quick ocean freight update for those of you that are interested. But anything else on from the trade world for you?
No, I think these are the most interesting things. The IEEPA case and the steel and aluminum derivatives. There's nothing. I'm encouraging importers to be mindful of the anti-dumping countervailing cases that are out there. I've seen a lot more activity in there, and I don't know why. It to me, as again my bias showing, it feels like rubbing salt in a wound. We're already at historically high tariff rates, so we're going to hit companies with anti-dumping of whatever percent and countervailing of whatever percent.
But at least isn't that a legitimate recourse? And I think we should come back and talk about that in episode 8. But those are mechanisms that were already set up to thwart unfair trade practices, and were used pretty aggressively in some industries. So that could be in preparation for potentially losing a challenge, right? That could be another mechanism, right? But I think we should come back and maybe talk about that in depth on episode 8 and talk about what we're really seeing, bring some data to the table. So anything else before we jump into freight?
No, let's talk freight.
Let's talk freight. So a couple weeks ago, right, we saw the reciprocal tariff on China drop substantially from 125 to what is it now, Kenton?
We are 10%, aren't we? I'm having a brain freeze.
10%. And which stacked, right? Giving us
stacking on top of the 301,
much higher duty rates, but still way lower than had been. And so we immediately saw, and again, we saw pictures of the port of Seattle completely empty, right?
Empty.
Not one container had been offloaded.
Tumbleweed. I did see the tumbleweed.
Yeah, trade had shut down, right? From China specifically to the West Coast and East Coast of the United States, and our ports were shut down and not working. And we've seen a dramatic spike in imports from China, and that's had the anticipated effects that we would see on rates, space, and equipment availability. The first thing that happens, as you know, is the Oprah Winfrey GRI season. You get a GRI, you get a GRI, you get a GRI, right? So general rate increases announced every 15 days. Peak seasons announced. We've seen ranges from $4,000. 2,500 for 40-foot containers, to all U.S. and Canada destinations on the Transpac trade. We see that coming up. We saw that on the 1st. We saw that we'll see that on June 15th. We'll see that on July 1st. And I'm sure 30 days out, we'll see that announcement made for July 15th as well. And we've seen a lot of cargo move, right? Rates went up. Rates went up. We've seen even the reintroduction of diamond tier rates from Mediterranean shipping, which we haven't seen the likes of since COVID. You want to talk about a diamond that doesn't make me feel special? Is the diamond tier rate from Mediterranean
blood
shipping?
Diamond.
Long way from the $25,000-$30,000 range that we'd seen in the past, right? During the height of the pandemic shortage for container space. But nonetheless, we saw rates skyrocket initially, and you have to think, if you're bringing in a container that's got a potential duty of $200,000 or $300,000, which is not unreasonable at all from what we've been seeing in the market, that paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 on a container is absolutely insignificant, and we've seen that play out with a bidding war on cargo. And we saw rates go up, and we saw the GRI and peak season that have been implemented through June 1st take us up to 6,000, 7,000, 10,000 to the East Coast, depending on the lane. And but I will tell you, these rates were lower than I expected. And from my point of view, and I'm curious what you're hearing, Kenton, the market is rapidly softening. It's like there was an enormous amount of cargo sitting there ready to move, and it's moving. Rates have increased, and now we're seeing almost an immediate pullback.
It reminds me of the early 2000s, even late 90s, post-Chinese New Year, where running up to Chinese New Year, there's product waiting to go. As soon as Chinese New Year is over, we get the containers loaded, and then there's the gap of now new product needs to be built. And so we end up with a lull. Although I wonder how much product is being built because of the tariff instability. There's that's where I think we experience some of this. We're experiencing a little bit of softness, which I wonder how the carriers are going to navigate that, because I read earlier today a few niche carriers started to come back into the market, and even carriers like MSC reintroduced old sailing schedules that they hadn't had because they were anticipating a much larger demand. And now we're basically adding supply into a market that looks to be a little bit soft. So
Absolutely. We're talking about 2.5 million TEUs of extra space, which is about 25% of the Transpac trade added this month, right? In the form of extra loaders, right? To clear up backlogs, to clear up roll pools, extra services, bigger vessels, or even, like you said, the niche operators trying to get in on this opportunity to make money, right? They've been starving for the last month and a half, and now there's a buffet in front of them, and so they're eating, and so now the question is, right, as supply and demand fluctuate, as specifically in this case, as supply increases, is it outstripping demand? And we are seeing now rates soften, and will they kind of bottom out a little bit? I don't think they'll go back to where they have been, right?
No.
But I don't think that they will remain at this level unless you, like you said, and this is where I think I'm not clear. And if somebody watching has any idea, drop a comment. I'd love your opinion. Is it because there's not yet freight to ship, or is it because demand is being satiated because the U.S. economy is weaker in general? There's not as much spending, right? It could cut either way. To your point, it could be that all the freight sitting on the docks that has been paused just moved, and now they're trying to make more. Or it could be there's been a demand reduction, right?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that either. I do have a hunch that if the CIT case goes in the favor of the plaintiffs and we see the stay immediately lifted and the reciprocal rates go back to zero, I could see another push like we saw pre-inauguration to maximize as much inventory. Because again, as I mentioned, if 301 and 232 are the mechanisms by which the president is going to be restrained to using to implement tariffs, they take some time. So
absolutely,
if things look like the reciprocal tariffs are going to get wiped out, there will be a push to ratchet up as much inventory ahead of that to take advantage of the situation. So I could see demand spiking again, but again, it's really dependent on how this unfolds.
And so with that, to go back, and I agree with your comments, but to go back to the comments you made earlier, Zim has brought the Zim Central China Express back into the trade, which is running 53 to 5600 TEUs, direct call Xiamen. It's a excellent service that they've been running and had taken out. A Mediterranean shipping company is resuming the Orient service, which is Qingdao, Ningbo, Shanghai, Busan, and Long Beach, with 14,000 TEU ships, right, which is a pretty big boon to capacity. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, which are part of the Gemini Cooperation, are launching a new service called TP9, right, which will cover Xiamen, Busan, and Long Beach. And we're seeing the return to the market of China United lines. There are a lot of, and we ran into this post-COVID, and it's worth mentioning. There are a lot of feeder lines that operate container ships. They might operate intra-China, intra-Asia. They might operate on the China, Asia to Australia trades. And when they see an opportunity, they've got smaller vessels, usually 2,000, 3,000 TEUs, and they see an opportunity to get into the Transpac trade while rates are high. It's pretty easy for them to deploy vessels onto the trade. A warning to our clients and friends out there, and I'm not speaking about China United Lines specifically, when you have a player that's not historically part of the Trans-Pacific service, we tend to see frustratingly bad customer service on the US side, right? They don't have the infrastructure, right? Visibility, no matter how good they may be somewhere else, they haven't built up the infrastructure here for customer support. And then we also saw during some of the most congested times, some of these new entrants not be able to dock, right? I mean, there's not, they don't have, for lack of a better word, dibs. They don't have slots at the port, right, to pull in. So they kind of get what is left over if there's a late vessel or things like that. And so while there may be deals to be found on them, right, the service can be pretty frustrating. And transit time can mean a real difference right now, especially if you think about the way the 232s are being implemented. If something had gotten here, 7 or 8 days ago, it would be a totally different duty cost. And so bringing all this back, I mean, we are seeing congestion increase, right? And again, how long that will last depends on, whether or not we are going to, how long this kind of boom out of China lasts. But we're seeing dwell times at the ports increase. We're seeing trucker shortages at some points, in the US. We're seeing warehouse space, chassis, and everything being out of position. It's far from the horrors that we've seen at other times in industries. But the fact is, and we've said this word probably 7 or 8 times on this podcast, bullwhip, right? And so I think we're staring down the barrel of that right now. So we've got solutions. We've got answers. We've got a lot of customers helping here at Mohawk Global, and we'd love to connect with anybody that needs support or wants to talk about these issues, or just wants to keep Kitten employed as a professional podcaster so his son can be proud of him, right? So
I apologize. I did recall my supplements are finally kicking in. I did recall one other tariff item of note.
Let's get it in there.
Not a lot of context, but the USTR, officially called the United States Trade Representatives, or who I like to call the United States Tariff Reapers, did do something positive, or what I'm perceiving as positive to the market. So in Section 301, we've had exclusions that were extended till the end of June. We all thought those exclusions were dead in the water. We found out late last week that the exclusions have been granted another reprieve and will be extended through the end of August. So that's interesting that we see what I might call an olive branch to trade with China by allowing these exclusions to extend yet again up till the end of summer. So this is good news. And if you're an importer of products that have this exclusion, you could end up with a double winning situation if the court finds the reciprocals are not valid. So it's just a neat little smiley face to end our podcast on.
Everybody needs a smiley face, and I'm glad your supplements are kicking in.
Hey, I remembered.
And I love it. This isn't going to work without your supplements and medications, because I'm borderline and you are the genius in this.
Oh,
and
we got lots of problems if I'm the genius.
I appreciate your insights, and I know our listeners do as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to just chat. It's fun.
All right, man. This was a lot of fun as always, and we'll be back with episode 8 before you know it, or before you want it, depending on who you are.
And of all the episodes, this is our latest.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.